The reports arrived June 7, 1942. Hashirajima Anchorage, Inland Sea of Japan. Rain taps softly against the steel flank of the battleship Yamato as Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, Chief of Staff to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, sits alone at a narrow desk beneath a shaded lamp, the smell of ink, oil, and damp uniforms hanging in the still air. Outside, moored ships lie quiet, but inside this cabin, the war is still burning. Ugaki loosens his collar, rubs his eyes, and opens the first after-action report from the Midway operation, the paper thin, the characters precise, and the meaning already heavy, before he reads a single line. He had expected losses. Every admiral expects losses. But he had not expected silence where names should be. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. The first three reports confirm what the wireless fragments had only hinted at. The fourth, delayed and trembling in its language, delivers the final blow. Hiryu, too, is gone. 4 fleet carriers, veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean Raid, the symbol of Japan's naval dominance, burned and sunk in a single morning beneath American dive bombers. Ugaki feels the deck vibrate faintly as Yamato's generators hum, and for a moment it seems as though the ship itself is breathing, alive, unaware that the heart of the fleet has been torn away. He reads of dauntless dive bombers falling out of the sun, of flight decks crowded with fueled aircraft, of bombs that found their mark with merciless precision. He reads of fires racing through hangars, of torpedoes detonating below the waterline, of captains ordering abandoned ship while their flags still flew. The language is formal, restrained, but behind every sentence he can see men running, slipping on burning decks, shouting into smoke. He pauses at a line noting the loss of experienced aircrews and flight deck personnel, and his hand tightens around the page. You can almost hear his mind counting not planes, not hulls, but years. Years of training, of carrier landings in rough seas, of coordinated strikes learned through endless drills. Japan had built carriers. That had been difficult but possible. But these men, these pilots, these deck officers, these signalmen, could not be replaced by decree or by steel. Outside the cabin, a junior officer passes quietly, sensing the gravity inside, while Ugaki continues reading, his face rigid, his jaw set not in anger but in calculation. He knows Yamamoto is nearby, absorbed in his own silence, and he knows that the combined fleet has not merely lost a battle, it has lost its margin. The reports describe American carriers maneuvering with confidence, launching and recovering aircraft even under threat, their damage control teams containing fires that might have doomed Japanese ships. Ugaki feels something colder than fear settle in his chest. Recognition. The enemy is not only brave, the enemy is organized, industrial, and patient. He sets the papers down, listens to the rain, and for a brief, treacherous second allows himself to imagine the American shipyards he has seen in intelligence photographs. Rows of hulls under construction, cranes like forests of steel. Then he looks back at the reports and realizes that Midway is not just a defeat, it is a measurement. A measurement of how quickly Japan can lose what it took a generation to build, and how slowly it can replace it. He exhales through his nose, folds the pages neatly, and prepares to carry them to Yamamoto, knowing that the conversation ahead will not be about tactics, but about limits. The reports pull Ugaki backward in time, whether he wishes it or not, dragging him across the Pacific to the morning of June 4th, 1942, when the sea east of Midway was calm and deceptively empty. On the flight deck of Akagi, the flagship, Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida's replacement teams had been moving with practiced speed, rolling aircraft into position. Fuel hoses snaking across planks darkened by oil and spray. Engines coughed and roared. The smell of aviation gasoline hung thick, sweet, and dangerous. Below decks, ordnance crews wrestled with bombs and torpedoes as orders shifted yet again, land attack, then anti-ship, then back, each change rippling through the ship like a tremor. The carriers had already launched one strike at Midway Island itself, and now reports of American ships confused, incomplete, were forcing Admiral Nagumo's staff into hurried recalculation. Ugaki's after-action summaries capture it in clipped language, but the reality was chaos constrained by discipline. At 10:20 a.m., the sky changed. American dive bombers, SBD Dauntlesses from Enterprise and Yorktown, appeared almost simultaneously above Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, their silhouettes small and steady as they rolled over and fell straight down. Japanese lookouts saw them too late. Fighter cover was out of position, low on fuel after chasing torpedo planes that had bravely but futilely attacked at wave-top height. The reports described the bombs as if they were abstract events: direct hit, near miss, secondary explosions. But Ugaki reads between the lines. He imagines the moment a 1,000-pound bomb punched through Akagi's flight deck, detonating among armed and fueled aircraft, turning the hangar into a furnace. On Kaga, multiple hits ignited rows of planes parked wingtip to wingtip, fire racing faster than men could run. Soryu was struck almost immediately, her decks vanishing beneath black smoke as control teams were cut down where they stood. Hiryu, momentarily spared, launched counterstrikes that crippled Yorktown, giving the illusion, brief, intoxicating, that the battle could still be salvaged. Ugaki knows how that illusion ended. American aircraft returned in the afternoon, found Hiryu alone, and finished her. The reports list times, headings, damage assessments, but they also list casualties in a way that makes Ugaki pause again and again. Squadron leaders lost, veteran pilots gone, deck crews killed at their stations. These were not green men. Many had flown at Pearl Harbor, at Rabaul, in the Indian Ocean. They were the backbone of the Kido Butai, men who could spot a fouled arresting wire at a glance, pilots who could land on a pitching deck in rain and darkness. As Ugaki reads, you can feel the battle compress into a terrible clarity. 4 carriers struck within minutes. The heart of Japan's striking power burned away in the time it took a kettle to boil. And unlike ships, time could not be spent backward. The morning sun over Midway had not just illuminated a tactical failure, it had exposed a structural weakness. Ugaki's pen taps once against the desk as he reads the final line of one report. Survivors rescued were minimal. Outside, the rain continues to fall on Yamato's deck, and the Admiral understands that what happened in those few minutes in the sky will echo through every operation to come. Ugaki closes his eyes for a moment, not in grief but in calculation, and when he opens them, the reports have transformed from narrative into inventory. He begins to count, not ships, but competencies. Each carrier lost represented not only steel and engines, but an ecosystem of experience refined over years of peacetime training and early war operations. He reads lists of missing air group commanders, senior aviators, landing signal officers, deck captains, ordnance specialists, names that recur across multiple reports because these men had rotated through the same elite units, teaching each other, setting standards, correcting errors before they became disasters. The Japanese Navy had prided itself on producing the finest carrier aviators in the world, but the system was brittle by design. Long, selective training pipelines that produced excellence slowly. In peacetime, that had been a virtue. In a war of attrition, it was a liability. Ugaki flips to annexes detailing aircraft losses. Planes could be replaced eventually, but pilots could not. The reports note that many survivors were rescued hours or days later, exhausted, burned, or wounded, and that few would return to flight status soon. He thinks of the replacement pilots waiting in training squadrons, men with fewer flight hours, less carrier time, and almost no combat experience. They would be brave, he knows, but bravery does not teach you how to judge glide slope in a crosswind with a damaged engine and a deck pitching beneath you. Ugaki's pencil circles a figure in the margin, the number of veteran pilots lost in a single day. He does not need to write the comparison that forms in his mind. Across the ocean, the Americans are training pilots in numbers Japan cannot match, using a system that emphasizes throughput and standardization over individual brilliance. Their pilots may not all be aces, but they are replaceable, and replacement, Ugaki is beginning to understand, is power. He turns another page and finds notes on damage control. American carriers, the reports grudgingly admit, absorbed hits and stayed afloat through disciplined firefighting and compartmentalization. Japanese carriers, optimized for offense and speed, had sacrificed survivability. That choice had once seemed acceptable. Now it looks reckless. Ugaki imagines future battles where even a single bomb could mean catastrophe, and the image tightens his chest. He looks up from the desk, hearing footsteps outside, and knows Yamamoto will soon ask the same questions he is asking himself. How many carriers can be built? How quickly? And with what crews? The arithmetic is brutal. Even if hulls can be laid down, even if steel and engines can be found, the human capital is gone. Years of institutional knowledge have been sunk with the ships. Ugaki realizes that Japan's early victories have been bought with the very resources now missing. Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, the Indian Ocean raid, all of them had consumed the irreplaceable core of the carrier arm. Midway did not start the problem, it revealed it. He gathers the papers into a neat stack, aligning the corners with care, a small gesture of control in a moment defined by loss. In his mind, the war shifts shape. No longer a series of decisive blows to be struck by superior skill, it becomes a race against time and production. A race he suspects Japan is already losing. Ugaki carries the stack of reports through narrow passageways to Yamato's flag spaces, the great ship's steel walls amplifying every footstep as if announcing the weight of what he holds. Inside, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stands near a chart table, his back straight, his hands clasped behind him, gazing not at maps, but at nothing in particular. The room smells faintly of tobacco and ink. When Ugaki presents the documents, Yamamoto takes them without ceremony, nodding once, and begins to read. He does not sit. He does not speak. Minutes stretch, broken only by the distant hum of machinery and the soft rustle of pages turning. Ugaki watches his commander's face closely, searching for anger, denial, anything, but Yamamoto's expression remains composed, the calm of a man who understands probabilities too well to be surprised by catastrophe. When he reaches the section listing aircrew losses, Yamamoto pauses, his eyes lingering on the columns longer than anywhere else. "We have lost our edge," he says at last, quietly, not as a lament, but as a statement of fact. He does not need to explain what that edge was. It had been surprise, concentration of force, and a cadre of aviators trained to a level no other navy had achieved in 1941. Yamamoto exhales, almost a sigh, and sets the papers down. He asks Ugaki about replacement schedules, about carrier construction timelines, about pilot training throughput. Ugaki answers honestly, and the answers land like stones. New carriers are planned, yes, but crews will be thin. Air groups will be filled with men who have never seen combat. The Americans, Yamamoto notes, have lost a carrier too, Yorktown, but reports suggest they will repair or replace her faster than Japan can complete even one new fleet carrier. The imbalance is not yet visible to the public, Yamamoto knows, but it is visible here, in this room. He turns to the map of the Pacific and traces a finger along the vast distances between islands. "We have awakened a sleeping giant," he murmurs, not as prophecy, but as confirmation. The phrase is not theatrical, it is weary. Yamamoto understands that naval war is not decided by courage alone. It is decided by logistics, by training pipelines, by the ability to absorb loss without breaking. Midway, he realizes, has cracked Japan's ability to do that. He orders Ugaki to prepare revised operational assessments, but his tone lacks urgency. The decisive battle doctrine that shaped their thinking has met a reality that refuses to conform. As Ugaki leaves the room, he senses that something fundamental has shifted. The combined fleet still exists, still has battleships and cruisers and submarines. But the heart, the carriers, and the men who made them lethal has been torn out. Yamamoto remains alone with the map, the reports lying open beside him, and for the first time since the war began, the future of Japan's naval war feels not uncertain but constrained. In the days that follow, Ugaki finds himself trapped between what the doctrine demands and what the reports insist is true. The Imperial Japanese Navy has been raised on the idea of the decisive battle, Kantai Kessen, a single overwhelming clash in which superior skill and spirit would shatter the enemy fleet and decide the war in one stroke. Midway was meant to be that battle, or at least the opening act. Instead, it has inverted the doctrine, turning Japan's own concentration of force into a vulnerability. In staff meetings, officers speak carefully, choosing words that do not challenge tradition outright, but the tension is unmistakable. How does one plan a decisive battle when the decisive weapons, fleet carriers and their air groups, are suddenly scarce? Ugaki listens as planners propose redeployments, consolidations, ways to mask weakness with posture. He takes notes, but his mind keeps returning to the after-action reports, to the cold precision with which the losses are recorded. Doctrine does not account for replacement rates. Doctrine does not care how long it takes to train a carrier pilot or a flight deck officer. Yet war, Ugaki now understands, cares very much. He compares training syllabi in his mind. Japan's long, selective process versus America's expanding pipeline. One produces excellence slowly, the other produces adequacy quickly and excellence eventually, through combat experience gained by sheer numbers. Midway has killed too many of Japan's teachers. Without them, even the doctrine cannot be transmitted intact. Younger officers will copy procedures without understanding their origins, flying and fighting by rote where veterans once improvised. Ugaki imagines future engagements where Japanese pilots meet Americans who are not as skilled individually, but are coordinated, supported by radar, and backed by a reserve that never seems to empty. He begins to see doctrine itself as a luxury, something that assumes time and margin. Both are now gone. As summer turns toward autumn, Midway's consequences stop being theoretical and begin to bleed into operations, most clearly in the desperate fighting around Guadalcanal. Ugaki reads fresh reports as they arrive, and each one feels like an echo of what Midway took away. Carrier divisions are thinner now, air groups patched together from survivors and newcomers who have never landed under fire. In August 1942, when American forces land on Guadalcanal, the Japanese Navy responds with urgency, but not with confidence. The carriers that remain must cover vast distances, their pilots flying longer sorties with less margin for error. In battle after battle, the Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, Japanese aviators still fight with ferocity and skill, but Ugaki notices the pattern forming in the margins of the reports: victories that cost too much. At Santa Cruz, American carriers absorb damage and withdraw, yet Japan loses more irreplaceable pilots. The enemy's ships limp away, but their aircrews survive. Japan's pilots, by contrast, burn with their planes or vanish into the sea. Ugaki underlines casualty figures with a hard stroke of his pencil, the motion betraying his frustration. This is Midway repeating itself in slower motion. The doctrine still calls these battles successes, but Ugaki feels the hollowness of that word. Each successful engagement further depletes the dwindling core of experienced aviators. Meanwhile, intelligence reports suggest American carrier strength is not shrinking but growing. New hulls are commissioning. New air groups are forming. Training units at home are expanding, not contracting. Ugaki imagines the Americans learning under fire, their losses teaching them faster than Japanese victories can teach Japan. The shadow of Midway stretches long over Guadalcanal, and every operation conducted without a deep reserve feels like gambling with a hand that cannot be replenished. Ugaki begins to understand that even if Japan wins tactically, it is losing strategically, trading irreplaceable men for replaceable ships. In his quieter moments, he thinks back to the rain tapping against Yamato's hull as he first read the Midway reports and realizes that the future he sensed then is now unfolding, one battle at a time, exactly as the arithmetic predicted. By early 1943, Ugaki no longer needs intelligence photographs or intercepted cables to understand American industry. He can see it clearly in what does not appear in Japanese reports. There are gaps, air groups that never reach full strength, carriers that sail without complete complements, pilots rush to the front with barely enough deck landings to qualify. The absence itself becomes evidence. Each planning document assumes fewer assets than the one before it, and each assumption quietly lowers expectations. Ugaki studies projected carrier completion dates and knows how deceptive they are. A hull launch does not mean a carrier ready for war. It needs trained deck crews, air group commanders, maintenance chiefs, pilots who trust each other and the ship beneath them. Japan can build steel faster than it can rebuild experience, and even steel is now constrained by shortages and bombing. Across the Pacific, the Americans appear to be solving the opposite problem, producing so much material that experience accumulates naturally through constant operations. Ugaki reads American after-action summaries captured through intelligence channels and notices their tone: methodical, analytical, obsessed with improvement rather than honor. Mistakes are catalogued and corrected. Losses are expected, then replaced. He compares this with Japan's reports, which still emphasize spirit and sacrifice, and feels the cultural gap widening into a strategic chasm. The realization is not dramatic, it is suffocating. There will be no sudden collapse, no single moment of acknowledgement. Instead, Japan will fight on, weaker each month, while the enemy grows stronger simply by continuing to exist. Ugaki looks at a map of the Central Pacific and imagines future battles not as contests, but as gradients, Japan sliding downward while America climbs. Midway, he understands now, was the inflection point, not because of what was lost that day, but because of what could never again be regained. In 1943 and early 1944, the promised carriers finally begin to appear on the charts. Shokaku repaired, Suikaku still afloat, and newer hulls like Taiho and the converted Junyo and Hiyo joining the order of battle. On paper, the numbers suggest recovery, even resurgence, and some officers allow themselves cautious optimism. Ugaki does not. He reads the readiness reports with the same cold eye he once used on Midway's after-action summaries, and what he sees confirms his fear: hulls without hearts. The flight decks are there, the elevators work, the engines turn, but the air groups are thin and uneven, composed of men trained too quickly by instructors, who themselves survived only because others died. Landing accidents rise. Formation discipline suffers. Radios crackle with confusion where veterans once needed only hand signals and instinct. Ugaki marks these failures not as individual shortcomings but as symptoms. Japan has carriers again, but it no longer has the living system that made carriers decisive. Meanwhile, intelligence briefs describe American fleet carriers arriving in waves, Essex-class ships commissioning one after another, each carrying air groups larger than entire Japanese carrier divisions of the early war. These ships are not experimental. They are standardized, built to a pattern refined by combat experience, crewed by men trained in an environment that assumes turnover and prepares for it. Ugaki imagines the contrast during an engagement: American carriers rotating damaged aircraft and tired pilots out of the line, Japanese carriers pushing the same men harder because there is no one else. The imbalance compounds with every sortie. When Taiho is lost at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, not to enemy bombs, but to internal failure after a submarine hit triggers catastrophic explosions, Ugaki is not surprised. He reads the report and recognizes the pattern. Poor damage control, inexperience under pressure, systems that require flawless execution by crews who no longer have the margin to be flawless. The battle itself becomes known among Japanese aviators as a slaughter, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and Ugaki feels Midway's logic complete its arc. The enemy's carriers survive. Japan's pilots do not. Replacement pilots are shot down faster than they can be trained, and the air arm collapses into a shell. Looking at the casualty tables, Ugaki understands that Japan has reached a point where even new ships cannot restore lost capability. The problem is no longer replacement. It is exhaustion. And exhaustion, unlike damage, cannot be repaired. By late 1944, Ugaki's desk is buried beneath papers that tell the same story in different ways, and he no longer needs to read every line to know how each report will end. Sortie counts fall. Aircraft losses rise. Fuel allocations shrink. Training hours are cut again and again until the term training itself becomes almost ceremonial. He studies tables comparing planned strength to actual strength and sees how wide the gap has grown. Where once Japan debated how to use its carriers, it now debates whether it can risk them at all. Ugaki notices a subtle shift in language. Phrases like expected losses and acceptable attrition begin to appear in documents where they never would have before. This is not confidence. It is resignation disguised as professionalism. He thinks back to the Midway reports, the first time he saw the future hiding inside columns of data, and recognizes how faithfully that future has arrived. The Americans, by contrast, appear almost indifferent to loss. Their after-action summaries speak of replacing squadrons, rotating crews, repairing ships in weeks rather than months. Numbers replenish themselves as if by instinct. Ugaki realizes that Japan is no longer fighting the American Navy alone. It is fighting American industry, American training doctrine, American logistics, an enemy that grows stronger simply by staying in the war. He feels no shame in this conclusion. It is not a moral failure, it is a structural one. Japan entered the war believing that quality could permanently overcome quantity. Midway proved that quality, once destroyed, becomes quantity's greatest victim. Ugaki closes another folder and sets it aside, aware that the verdict has already been delivered, even if no one will say it aloud. The carriers lost at Midway were not just ships sunk in battle, they were the final expression of a system that could not survive replacement warfare. In the quiet that follows the last reports of 1944, Ugaki allows himself a rare honesty. The realization does not arrive as despair, but as clarity. He understands now that the war turned not on courage, not on tactical brilliance, but on whether a nation could replace what modern war consumed at industrial speed. Midway was the first proof. 4 carriers lost in a single morning, hundreds of irreplaceable men gone with them. At the time, it had felt like catastrophe. In hindsight, it was diagnosis. From that moment on, every Japanese naval decision was constrained by absence, by pilots who never returned, by deck crews who could not be taught fast enough, by instructors who died before they could pass on what they knew. Ugaki thinks of the Americans reading their own after-action reports, not with dread, but with a craftsman's focus, asking how to build better, faster, and in greater numbers. He sees how their system absorbs failure and turns it into momentum, while Japan's system breaks when its finest components are removed. Standing at a window and watching the inland sea glint under winter light, Ugaki accepts that no future victory can undo the arithmetic revealed at Midway. Even if Japan fights on with determination, even if individual battles are won, the strategic balance cannot be restored. The carriers that burned in June 1942 took with them Japan's only margin for error. In that knowledge, Ugaki does not rage. He simply knows. And knowing in war is often the most painful moment of all.